My name is Kieron Hunt, and I'm the planning studio lead at FBM Architecture based out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and certainly no stranger to ICSC. In addition to retail market analyses that I conduct across the country, I'm currently the co-chair for ICSC's P3 retail program, as well as the returning co-chair for the ICSC Whistler Conference, a do-over if you will. Almost 1 year ago, we got our first look into the pandemic world that was not on a movie screen. But with this week's positive outlook for vaccinations in our country, it is looking like there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and even more like in-person events like ICSC Whistler will be back in 2022, fingers crossed. As a planning committee, we're moving full steam ahead with that in our view, and to host those in-person events and revel in those interactions that we all enjoy and miss so much at Whistler, whether that's in Garibaldi Lodge, Whistler Village, or on the chairlifts. I'm very excited today to moderate and participate in a panel of highly respected colleagues who will share their thoughts and insights on the near-term future and how the pandemic has created yet another shift in the ever-shifting retail landscape. But as with most things, with every shift or challenge, there is an opportunity. And with that, I'd like to introduce the speakers that we have today. We're honored to have Claude Sirois, David Ian Gray, and Scott Lachut with us. Based out of Montreal, Claude is a 30-year veteran of the commercial real estate and was former president of retail for Ivanhoe Cambridge, where he oversaw the investment, operational, and leasing activities of their shopping center portfolio in North America. Claude is currently a member of ICSC's Board of Trustees, and we'll hear from him shortly. David is the principal at Dig 360 and is a recognized expert on retail and shopper trends, consistently producing high-impact knowledge for over 29 years. David provides fresh counsel across Canada to founders, CEOs, and executives on defining customer relevance, rethinking customer experience, and tailoring roadmaps for evolving their retail concepts. He's a sought-after expert on emerging retail trends and other drivers of information. He is also the co-founder of the Business of Retail podcast, which if it isn't on your playlist yet, I would highly recommend making a point of subscribing. Last but certainly not least is Scott Lachut. We've brought some American flair to our discussion today by way of New York. Scott is a partner and president of research and strategy at PSFK, a leading business intelligence platform that provides strategic insights around brand, retail, and customer experience and innovation. In addition to his work at PSFK, Scott teaches at City College's Branding and Integrated Communications Master's Program. Welcome to each of you. And let's take a peek into this crystal ball. We're going to take a positive look forward into 2021 here. And I think we can all agree now that at a high level, online shopping is not its own entity unto its own. It is actually simply shopping, full stop. And I thought we'd kick things off with a conversation with Claude to lead on, to say that you live and breathe the landlord-tenant relationship is quite an understatement, Claude. And that dynamic is extremely sensitive and evolving. And you used the term in one of our other conversations, and what is the secret to the caramel? And it's always stuck with me. So how is that landlord-tenant relationship changing as a result of the pandemic?
Thank you, Kieron. Good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be with you this afternoon. By the way, I don't remember the last time I had a caramel, so can't really tell you the secret of that caramel. Just before I dive into your question, I just want to take a moment to go back to the video that was shown earlier. This is a new concept that will be opening up in London, and then there are, I think, many more concepts, similar concepts that will be rolling out, in the world. But what did we see in this video? We saw innovation, we saw connection, we saw emotions, we saw partnerships. And I think the whole purpose of today's conversation is to have a forward look. Every opportunity I have to find ways to change the narrative about what we're reading in the newspaper, I take advantage of. And, obviously, there are great things despite what we're reading in the newspaper that are being done. And there's still a high percentage of the retail sales in Canada that are done in the physical space. a high number of those sales. And talk to any retailers out there, they couldn't do without the bricks and mortar. And then I'm glad that we're joined with Scott out of New York. If we look at what's happening in New York at the moment, not in New York, but in the US at the moment, I mean, we're not going to debate if they are successful in rolling out the vaccine. They are very successful. I think every adult by the end of May will have a vaccine. We're, I don't know, number 44 on the list of performance across the world, but that's a different topic. That being said, they're obviously ahead of us in restoring confidence in having people in public space. And when I read articles from Tanger Outlet, as an example, saying that they are seeing the same footfall in their malls currently than they were seeing pre-COVID, that is hope that we're going to get out of this. So to go back to your question, a couple of thoughts here that come to mind, and I have four of them. I have trust, business model, transparency, and agility. Trust. Trust is a little bit like love. It takes both parties have to feel it before it really exists. I think the trust in the last few months has been somewhat tested between landlords and retailers. That being said, I think if there is this proximity and all of those conversations that have been taking place, whether or not they were positive or negative, have taken place. And I strongly believe that this is an opportunity to reset the level of conversation between retailers and landlords to a point where we can move on to redefining eventually the business model that we're all in. That the business model that was built in the industrial era, but also that business model that I think we should redefine, redesign for the next 50 years. We all talked about the metrics. The metrics are somewhat, to be revisited, refreshed. And I'm a believer that, with the communication that has taken place between the parties, that we will be able to redefine the metrics that are the basis of our business model. There are some examples that are happening in Europe where we're redefining the business model, where there's a mall developer in Europe that is testing a new business model based on having shorter leases, more breaks between landlords and tenants, more transparency as it relates to the financial figures, the profits being generated by the space, but also introducing metrics as footfall and MOPES to ensure that the space is valued appropriately. The third one was transparency. I think it's a great opportunity to elevate the transparency between the parties. The transparency is related to financial data, to consumer data, in order to enhance the overall experience that we offer in our shopping environment and to the stores. And last but not least, agility. I think the winners over the next few years are going to be the ones that are going to incorporate agility in our execution. Unfortunately, in the institutional world where I come from, it's very, very natural and normal to go back into process and expenses and etc. because this is the environment that we're in. But I strongly believe agility, having an entrepreneurial spirit, provoking opportunities, creating new ideas, increasing the risk level will be key for the next winners in this the next phase of our development, which I strongly believe is going to be pretty exciting.
Kieron, may I comment on something Claude just said? First of all, amazing overview of what's going on, especially tying the tenant to the landlord. I think in my experience, years working in the sector, they tended to have been really segregated into their bubbles. And I think we're seeing how that can't persist. And there needs to be non-transactional interplay in the future. But Claude, when you talked about the transparency factor and how there might be some collaboration required around that, I do think that the trust issue has to be resolved a little bit further for that to be able to occur. And I don't want to harp on, like you said, it's happened, but it also continues to happen a little bit. I think in the shopping center environment with national chains, national leases, you've had most of those conversations. But there's a big class of retail in this country, independent retail and food service, that are on streets, that are generally dealing with independent owners. And they have a different economic model. The most successful of those are still family businesses, and they don't have, the bank behind them or the equity investors. They're putting kids' education in jeopardy the longer they hang on, and they're ordering product for next seasons. If they don't trust that someone's got their back as we see this extending through summer, we're already seeing a lot of them just bailing. Good ones. I don't mean, there's a lot that aren't that good and they're going to go anyway. So, I think there is a need, if for the people watching this here on the leasing side, don't sort of skip over that issue of trust. There were a lot of bad retail behaviors that took place right at the beginning of this. And there's some big names where you guys got together with right away and said, hey, we'll look after you. But there's a silent or not silent majority in the middle where when those demand letters went out from some of you, that sent ripple effects through everything. And I know because I was getting calls repeatedly on it. So I think it's resolvable, but don't skip that rebuilding of trust, because the future will need collaboration. And if you're looking at new metrics and trying to find ways to tap into their online sales performance generated by the retail space, there's going to have to be a shared interest around that and the ability to sit down and talk about it.
David, I couldn't agree more. I think this will require an open and transparent communication between the parties. Just to give you an example, when previously in my role, we launched an initiative, very innovative initiatives that relates to gathering data from the developer, from the retailer, and also adding on technology to this. So I will always remember, the response from a well-known national chain to the request, and for their participation to the request to be part of this initiative. And as much, I totally understand the notion and the importance of consumer data, but their response was, no, we won't participate because this is another way for you to collect more rent from us. So I think this is hopefully behind us, because we've all been hit. Nobody was immune, and we need to elevate the conversation to a point where we need to openly share data on both sides, build that trust, rebuild the business model so that we can all move forward and have fun in the environments that we're going to be creating.
With the way that leasing structures, and I work with a lot of small towns across the country. And those small towns, you're dealing with a lot of businesses that are owner operators of the buildings themselves as well, and so they're looking at it from two lenses, as the property owner as well as the business operator, and that presents challenges. And then you have smaller landlords who are looking at their spaces, traditionally looking at leasing 1,500 square feet to one user, but having a certain degree of stubbornness about trying to still lease that full space out. And we need to work as an industry to educate with those landlords to understand that is there value for them just thinking about leasing 500 square feet to incubate local retailers and bring them back to those environments. And mostly in these cases, we're talking about small towns or main streets or small downtowns where there's vacancies. And we need to try to cultivate the growth of new businesses back into this dynamic, and to do so, they may not take larger 1,500 square foot spaces. They may be looking at just 500 square foot or 400 square feet. And that might require month-to-month leasing. It might require the old, it's not as much as it is new that in shopping centers, you used to have your kiosk models, which are temporary leasing structures. That approach needs to be brought back into the physical world, perhaps as well in that discussion.
Claude, you were sharing on a separate discussion the Brazil model, where the rent actually flexes over holiday season. So it's not, there's the Western or Canadian or North American model, but there's a lot of other examples globally to draw from.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. I mean, but however, that being said, I think all those business models are being tested. I'm not so sure that in Brazil you can still charge double rent in December and key money in order to get access to the space. They're under stress like everybody else. So all those business models need to be refreshed, revisited in order to better be aligned with the new realities.
Scott, who's on the call here, I attended the PSFK Retail Innovation Week a year ago, when we were still on the tail end of NRF in New York in January. And Scott, it was fabulous. And just the number of kind of innovative uses of space. Of course, New York has a huge population density, but you guys toured that. So you must be seeing some patterns in terms of what Kieron's talking about, sort of flexible space and innovative pop-up and that sort of thing.
Well, absolutely. And thanks for that little plug, David. I appreciate it. And hello to everyone. I've been just quiet on the sidelines trying to figure out how best to chime in here. But to your point, when I was listening to Claude initially kind of talk through those 4 points, there's a lot of agility, I think, was the thing that really stood out to me. And I know we'll talk about this a bit later, but we do a big retail report every year and try to take an angle on what's happening more broadly within the industry. And this year, we were focused on resilience as a sort of broader topic. And one of the things within the context of that, and I think this applies to the business model case as well, is really sort of leaning into this notion of test and learn and being willing to fail in some instances, but obviously have the system in place in order to enable you as a business or whether that's a retailer or as a landlord or whatnot to willingly sort of see what's going to work and what's not going to work, have those partnerships in place in order to sort of have the relationship with a retailer, whether they're starting out or established, and then figuring out what's going to work long term. And I think I think what Claude is sort of getting at within the context of how they're thinking about things is I think appropriate. It's probably going to be a range of options that are going to need to be on the table. Some of those might fall off at the end of the day, but then seeing what's ultimately going to work. And no one wants to see storefronts shut down. As a consumer walking down the street, it's not a very hopeful sign. And I know in New York, one of the challenges, and perhaps this is the U.S. in general, is some of these landlords have tax breaks, and it's to their advantage to actually keep those storefronts closed rather than being experimental. And it just doesn't create the most hopeful landscape, let's say. So I think there's a lot of the willingness to embrace change, I think, is really important.
Claude, when you talked about the 4 pillars, those 4 pillars there, and when we think of trust and the transparency and agility, I think of percentage rents and how, in order for percentage rents structures to be successful, you have to have a trust and a level of transparency. And I feel that had gone by the wayside a bit. And that's another way that when the business prospers, the developer, the landlord can prosper through those agreements. But those have fallen out of favor. And I think this type of a pandemic has brought those back to the forefront. But that speaks exactly to what you were saying in those pillars, which I think are very valuable for everyone on the call to think long and hard about. You know, if we shift a little bit here, and we think that there was a recent article in Chain Store Age magazine, and it profiled, that's a US publication, but of all companies, it profiled a Canadian rural home improvement retailer, PV Mart. And they even went so far as to call them a lifestyle retailer. But they were profiling them in the manner that they are pivoting, and I hate using that word, so I apologize, but that they are shifting to an omni-channel and really investing in their omni-channel. And, you know, Scott, you touched on the PSFK's publication, Future Retail 2021, a playbook for resilient retail. And from your perspective in that, can you share with us a little bit about how the retailers or shopping centers are changing, or how omni retail and that digitization is changing the business model for physical retail?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the big thing for me is that we're now at a moment where if the business model is sort of appropriately constructed, that physical retail can offer an operational advantage by the fact that it creates opportunities to be closer to the consumer. And what that means is that the sort of role that the store plays needs to evolve. Is it still going to be a place where people are going to walk in off the street and make purchases? Absolutely. But perhaps the percentage of sort of square footage that's dedicated to that might not be as much anymore. Because the way that I think physical retail is quite interesting is almost, I would call it an extension of the digital retail experience. And what I mean by that is, certainly in the height of the pandemic, we've seen a shift to huge acceleration of percentage of retail sales happening in a digital only context. But more and more what we're seeing is that from a consumer point of view, whether they're going to be shopping it in store, digital plays some sort of a role in that. Whether that's doing research ahead of time to make sure that a product that you're interested in is actually in stock. Obviously, in the context of COVID, there's the whole sort of safety protocol, trying to understand what the foot traffic looks like within the context of that store, what the safety protocols are, et cetera, et cetera. But then when you think about the desire of the consumer to do their shopping online, but then pick up in store, which I know, has been hinted at already, the shift to curbside. So then that creates an operational advantage for the business to, again, offer that as an alternative to, even next day, if you can drive up in an hour and get your items loaded into your trunk, then that's sort of doubling down on that convenience factor. So I think that's really interesting. And again, for me, it's getting closer to the consumer. And then the other thing that I think is quite interesting, and then I'll step back to let others chime in, is when you start to think about the role that the physical store can play beyond sort of a logistical piece into almost being a stage for the digital shopping journey. And so, again, this is pretty nascent, but what we're starting to see is, I'll just give you an example. A beauty brand called Beauty Counter also operates physical retail, just launched a store in Los Angeles that has a percentage of what typically would have been their showroom set aside as a studio space where they can actually do one-to-one or one-to-many sort of live selling events that utilize the store and all of its products as a backdrop to support shoppers who are looking to, transact in a digital-only context. And that creates some interesting relationships with the consumer, the brand, the retail associates within that space. And I think that's really interesting. And more we're starting to see this becoming a a new option for companies that are thinking again how the physical store then helps close the sale in a digital context as well.
So Scott, I just have a question from and I'll call upon your crystal ball. So from what you're seeing and from your other discussions with the retailers and your clients, what are the categories that you feel are gonna come out, post pandemic stronger, and what are the ones where you think it's going to be a little more challenging?
It's a great question. I think obviously what we have seen is that within the context of these, and you're speaking specifically within the context of sort of operations overall or physical retail specifically?
Let's say physical retail.
Okay. I think we see high touch categories that still benefit from having a consumer come in and interact with a product will continue. And again, I think it requires a little bit of rethinking of how the sort of store supports that. But again, I'll use another example. I think while Best Buy is in the process now of kind of like streamlining its operations a little bit, they've been, I think, doing some really nice things within the context of the pandemic. They adopted appointment shopping pretty early on when people were by and large not going into stores, and getting someone on the phone or via chat to understand what that consumer was looking to achieve by actually coming into the store, which gave them the opportunity to then sort of tailor that experience to the consumer, which I think is interesting, and I think is something that can benefit a business sort of moving forward. They've always had that sort of expertise lens kind of front and center. And again, you can replicate some of that online, but I still think there's a benefit to having a conversation with an individual with the product as the sort of connection point there, which I think is quite interesting. And then they are thinking about their physical retail again from a very sort of logistical lens, where they're shrinking their physical footprints of many of their stores. They're focusing on the top performing SKUs as actually being available on the showroom floor, if you will. They can certainly carry more products in the background, and have the ability to, again, even if they don't have a product in stock when someone comes into that store, to have the ability to then get that to that shopper within a day or two, let's say. So I think for me, it's less category specific, but I think it's more sort of how all of the channels are effectively kind of complementing each other within the context of that sort of shopper journey. And again, I think a company like Nike is doing a very good job as well, recognizing that they have a very successful mobile app based on the behaviors of the consumers that are using that mobile app. They're able to tailor some of the merchandising that they're doing within the context of specific stores as well. And so I think that's really interesting. Their app translates very well into the sort of post-COVID shopping experience because it creates contactless shopping experiences as well. And so there's a lot of interesting ways that kind of plays. And then, last thing I will say is, even a category like grocery, which, I think will likely, a lot of that will continue to, or more and more of that shopping will shift online. What I think is interesting is, if you think of the BOPUS model as a way of getting shoppers to save time, if they had 30 minutes or an hour for that shopping trip, if they do the majority of that before they leave their home, then you have that extra time to actually get them into the store. and provide things that sort of add value to that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Demos, services, whatever the case is. And I think that's also quite interesting as well. So I spoke a lot, so I'll stop. But
I'd like to pick up on something you said though, Scott, that flowed from Claude, which is the future is going to have to be developing new models, and obviously that you mentioned test and learn. That we need to create an atmosphere where experimentation gets rewarded. But I think ironically, and particularly in Canada, I'll say, both retailer and landlords, developers have tended to be pretty cookie cutter and conservative over the years. And I've worked with retail clients where what they think is experimentation is basically an incremental little adjustment that the average shopper wouldn't even notice. So we need to create that environment where it's safe to make the mistakes. But I agree with you 100%. The one thing I do want to really emphasize is every conference I go to, I've always heard a leader on the stage say, we're doing this because the customers are telling us we need to do this. This being whatever, call it the move to big box 15 years ago, or anything that gets done to change because the customer wants it. I don't agree with that. We study customers day in, day out. They want to get things faster or have enjoyable experiences. All ages still like compelling physical experiences. And in BC, where we're a little bit more open, we do, Costco's busy. You could order online, but the store is busy. They offer the little extras in there when you can see things and see what's new. So the customer is incredibly adept and skilled at gaming systems. So if we start putting things in front of them, like apps, and Apple put the cash is no cash anymore, it's cash as it's out on the floor. We learn what we like and don't like pretty quickly, but we don't know what we don't know yet. So I think the idea of this experimentation isn't just internal to the businesses, it's also helping consumers identify what's going to work for them. Because we're in flux. When I put consumer hat on right now, I'm in flux too, especially through COVID. I don't quite know where it's going to go. But I do think physicality's got a role to play outside of this. I am 100% convinced of that. It's just going to be different. But can I say one more at you, by the way? You didn't mention reverse supply chain. That's another reason why you should have physical stores, because the number of items getting returned over the holidays was off the charts. And it's way more convenient for me if I could go take it to the local 20-minute drive away and get them to handle it than me to start going through the call center and do all that sort of stuff. Done.
David, and I'm gonna ask you a question in a moment here and work my way up to that. And prior to the pandemic, I was using this phrase called hyper expedience, and this came to me after going to Portugal, going to a coffee shop and asking for a coffee to go, and getting the strangest look as to why on earth would I want a coffee to go. And the only solution they had was to give me 2 clear plastic cups, and it was too hot for me to even walk, so I sat. And at that point, my whole mindset shifted to realizing that the enjoyment of the physical space of interaction was paramount. The pandemic shook that up, but when I came back and I saw how retailers like Starbucks with mobile phone orders, you could pick up order your coffee, run in and grab it and get out. And it was this hyper expedience that was really starting to transform. And now we're seeing how the pandemic itself has changed things. And in 2020, the restaurant and development and design had some really interesting stats from a reader survey that they had. And they had said that in 2020, 41% saw their biggest investments in outdoor dining, but 26% of their investments were in what they called sanitation theater, which I thought was an incredible phrase to use as far as cleaning up the vernacular there. And another 12% were in drive-through additions and upgrades. But when they were asked about their view for 2021, 41% expected takeout and delivery only options will drive their development, and 32% will focus on redesigning, expanding, and upgrading drive-through operations and in their new and existing locations. So, while I was coming back thinking about the world of this hyper expedience and thinking maybe we could recapture that physical and value of the personal space a bit more. The pandemic has thrown that all out of flux again. And David, you've talked a lot about street front retail and independent retail and food service and how big a hit that industry has taken. What do you feel is the recourse for responding to this, and what does the recovery look like for them particularly?
Well, you said a couple things there. Just going back to Claude was saying what categories are in demand. I think food service, restaurants, bars, that sort of thing on the comeback out of COVID. At least there'll be a surge for a while, and not everybody. Some people are going to not be as into it, but the one thing I want to say is we got to be super careful not to make absolute statements right now. When we say the customer, that's so divided and disparate. You've got young people who aren't always totally aware that there is COVID, and they're doing things. You've got people who are more at risk, who are going into new patterns. Some people have more money than they had a year ago. And Scott, like in Canada, there's been a lot of wage subsidy efforts from different levels of government. So some people are they've got more cash in the bank, they're paying down debt and things like that with it. There's other people who are really hurting and scared of the future. So and that's at the consumer level. We're seeing the same thing at the retail level. We're seeing the strong ones, the Lululemons, Aritzias in Canada, for example. Some of your grocers, Costco is doing great. I mentioned them. So some of the strong ones who are already transforming ahead of COVID, who were in good, healthy financial positions, are going to come out of this better than ever. Nike's, Scott mentioned. There's a lot that are floundering in the middle. We don't put a question mark on them. And you guys are all well aware of the number of receivership plays that went on. Some of them, you might argue, were a little bit bogus or opportunistic, but others were going to happen anyway. So strong getting stronger, weak getting weaker, a lot of confusion, which means for me, it's a mistake to try and put a pin in the ground in the map, like what's going to happen in 2 years. I'm viewing it as there's a number of scenarios that are all in place still, and we just need to be ready for whichever one of those. And I kind of say utopian or dystopian. There could be a lot of opportunities for certain categories. Fashion, they're already in a dire pickle because they're over fashioned, they're over stored. But that's at a macro level. For me, a healthy retail ecosystem fundamentally requires really good independence, and both restaurants and retailers. And when you think of communities, main streets and street fronts, because it's not just the mall shopping. When we see for lease, and then maybe there is a Starbucks doing a great job, and then for lease, what does that do to that Starbucks? So we're going to see a lot more closures we've barely seen the start of that. And I think a lot of the closures will kick in after the vaccines go through. Like there's a lag effect with what the businesses are going to respond with, because we don't even know how badly a lot of them are bleeding right now. In the wake of that, we're also seeing a huge opportunity with what I'll call indie direct-to-consumer. Like there's so many cool, and Scott covers these too, cool kind of homegrown brands. They could be fashion, they could be housewares, anything lifestyle. A lot of them have purpose embedded in them, and they're digitally native is the term. They're starting off online. We get calls from them. It's like a Darwinian soup. So there's a whole lot out there. A lot of them, in my mind, don't have the business acumen to overshoot the excitement they've generated with being very good social networkers and storytellers. But others do have that acumen. And it's just hard to pick and choose winners. But when you think about a developer landlord environment that tends to be fairly rigid and long in timeline for paybacks, and then you've got these nimble direct-to-consumer guys growing, but they're going to hit a wall on their online sales. They're going to start to look to how they can keep growing for the ones who want to, and they're going to look to their own stores or pop-up or selling wholesale. how are we anticipating that? And again, it requires that flexibility and new models. So in long run, independence will always be there, but I am very concerned about short run and what that does to community donations, local employment. There's vendors that rely on independence that don't have the scale. They're scaling up at the same time. So they can't go into the big guys yet. They're making their way through with the independents. I have huge concerns for that. Not that we make our own living off of independence, but because I can see the ripple effect of what might come. And I think they need a lot of help that they're just not getting. And it's almost too late now. I think we're gonna have to see how that plays out. And a lot of them we're going to go anyway with the Amazon effect, if you want to call it that. But there's a lot of good ones that are kind of call them the flagship independents that are on your streets. So I think that's an observation. The one thing I'll say, I think a theme for me out of this conversation and prior is we need to really think of an ecosystem for retail and collaborations and creating vendors, developers, landlords, retailers, online, offline, technology innovators. We need to find ways we can kind of co-create more than just try and glue things together after someone's developed something. And the only reason that'll happen, in history, people who weren't in the same camps came together when there's a common enemy. So I think the common enemy may have to be Amazon or maybe Alibaba, because we never talk about them in North America. There's got to be a reason why we start coming together a little bit better. And big retailers helping the independents and vendors we're all in it together. And I'm not saying that because I'm just a nice guy. I'm actually not. Most of my friends say I'm pretty selfish and I don't even like people much. But I can kind of see why, if we want to win on the other side of this, any one of us, we kind of are way more dependent today on others than we were 20 years ago.
Okay, we like you, David.
I like some people. Anyway, we can talk about it. Anyway.
I mean, just a couple of thoughts. You mentioned about the actual performance of the retail industry. Just one observation that's important when we look at the brands that have continued to thrive through this pandemic. It's their own brand, their own, their multiples in the public market are way higher. The Arizias and the Lululemons and the Apples of the world, their multiples are way higher than the ones that are multi-brand, which have to do a little bit more work to redefine, readjust their business model. That's just one observation. So out there, I'm just going to throw a question out there, and Scott, I'd like you to chime in. If you were going to build a brand new shopping center from scratch, where would you start? What could we see into it?
Well, I actually have thought about this a little bit. I think for me, one of the things, and again, I'm a little bit naive, but maybe that's a good perspective to kind of come from, I suppose. But I think there's a huge opportunity for retail landlords at the shopping center level to offer a lot of infrastructure that supports the retailers and brands who ultimately have storefronts within that space. For me, recognizing that the buy online, pick up in store, curbside piece, the distribution level, getting closer to consumers in a same day or next day kind of capacity is number one, is having that sort of warehousing or logistics arm that supports all of the retailers. And again, the dream is, as a shopper, you sort of go through and shop all of your stores, and then it either winds up in the trunk of your car or, it's there to greet you when you get home, let's say. Obviously, there's a lot of complications and things that requires. I think also there's this sort of idea that I will call the kind of plug and play model, which is having the right kind of tech stack, if you will, particularly from a sort of data rich environment for a retailer to literally kind of come in, be able to plug into that environment, know that they're going to have the ability to understand what's happening within the context of that shopping environment. And, it doesn't have to be cookie cutter, but like the sort of, again, it's there kind of in the background. And again, for me, technology, generally speaking, works best when the customer doesn't see it. And so it's all of those sort of operational pieces that I think are really important. And then, whether it's, we've seen that the sort of like outdoor shopping malls, just by virtue of the fact that it's not all under one roof, have thrived during COVID because, it's a little bit more conducive to people being outside. I think there's something to be said for, even if we're in sort of the traditional shopping center that I grew up in, which is you go in and it's, you're walking down a main street indoors and there's a bunch of shops. I think there's something interesting about how to recontextualize that space and make it much more fluid as it applies to the sort of like break between, there's not a physical break between kind of stores. And, at least again, from what I've been familiar with growing up is, every store kind of existed in its own little box, but, what's to say that can't sort of bleed out into the rest of the space a little bit as well. So those are the things that immediately kind of come to mind for me. And then I'm sure David has some thoughts as well, so I'll step back.
Well, just one, which is sometimes what's new was old. And I remember when shopping centers would have in that era, some really must-have tenants, but then there'd be a lot of regionalized and localized tenants in the mix. So mall to mall wouldn't necessarily look exactly the same. But the economics of the industry on both sides led us to a point where national deals were getting signed with national or global chains, put them in all the places. And there's a lot of good economic reason for it. But I think what we're left with then is something that may not be as exciting for shoppers, that it could be, that it might be. And if we're talking about a number of localized brands that are bubbling up, I think trying to find a little bit of that balance again that we used to have is one thing that comes to mind. And then the other point that was really, Claude, you made about multi-brand retailing versus mono-brand. I don't know. I'd really be nervous about being a multi-brand retailer right now, although someone like Winners has rocked it and continues to. You can find the examples, but generally in department stores, Hudson Bay, that sort of thing. But again, I'll point back to Scott, because Scott, you guys really introduced to me people like Neighborhood Goods out of the US that were kind of turning the idea of a house of brands, but not owned brands, a little bit on its side. And I don't know how many of the listeners are really up on examples like that, but do you have some in your back pocket that are not mono brands going physical, but where it's a collection of brands?
Well, to your point, I think Neighborhood Goods is, and I have mixed feelings about them, because I do think they're doing some very interesting things, but I think a lot of it is the marketing of what they're doing, honestly. But that said, I think where they're doing something interesting is what you touched on before, David, which is they are cultivating these relationships with these direct-to-consumer brands that maybe haven't had the ability to go into physical retail, and they have, by and large, these communities or brands, because they're built online, have sort of grown communities alongside of them. To your point, they have purpose associated with them. They have catchy design. They're tailored to the sort of core demographic that everyone is ultimately after. And then they've kind of wrapped it into this nice kind of synergistic shopping experience that is just more modern, I think, ultimately. And so, they, within the US, they kind of came on the scene around the same time as another company within New York called Showfields, who I think did not, in my opinion, create as successful as a model, while it sort of by and large was intended to be the same thing.
I wouldn't go back a second time. I went to show. I thought it was really cool, like a museum, but I don't need to go back to the museum for a long time.
It's not a, the other. I think like in the case of Showfields, as a consumer, you couldn't necessarily go in and walk out with a product, which I think is a very confusing proposition for people. That people still expect that they're going to be able to walk into a store and get something unless it's not available on the shelf right then and there. And I think if you're going to have that sort of a model, then you need to do a lot more education up front. But Claude, I think it looks like you have opinions on the neighborhood goods of the world. So I don't want to take all the airtime, but
hey, don't worry about me. I always have opinions. I know Matt. I've seen the stores. I've walked the stores. I spent time with them. And it's in terms of, I mean, they were described as the department store of the future, okay? Which, kind of makes sense because millennials don't want to get into a department store that has escalators, so they don't have escalators, which is a good thing. But what was in the business model, to me, was great to give exposure, a window for pure play retailers. However, because of the fact that they want a novelty and wanted those brands to turn around, to change every 3, 6, 9 months, as a consumer, let's say you buy a product, Hims was there the time I told the store, and then so let's say I'm going back because I like whatever hair products that I bought from them and I want to renew, and they're gone. So the consumer experience related to brands that turn a lot might be an issue. So that's my opinion on neighborhood goods. But just two things. How much time do we have, Kieron, left?
We've got a couple minutes, and I was just wanting to touch base on a couple questions from.
There's some questions popping up too there. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, I'm a absolutely strong believer that the experience economy will explode after post-COVID. There are all kinds of new concepts, that are being developed. It will be great to see, what will happen. But people need to socialize. They need to have fun. They need to be taken somewhere else. I was recently having a conversation with the CEO of Meow Wolf out of Santa Fe, who's just opening up in Vegas. There's hype, there's buzz around the experience economy. The big challenge is we can say that. That's now the developer in me that is talking. Those are costly venture. Those are risky venture. But I think at the end of the day, the ones that are going to be taking the risks are going to be rewarded, because I think that the experience economy will be super successful. One last very, very important thing, and I'm going to do an infomercial here for a second. I just want to say one thing about talent, okay? We are in an industry that has been hammered in the last 12 months, right? And it's super, super hard to go out there and convince new, young, talented individuals, hey, why don't you come and have a career in the retail industry, right? Because all they know about is what they're reading in the newspaper. But boy, do we need them. Boy, do we need, those new, fresh ideas to transform, redevelop, redefine our business. And you know what? There's never been a better time for new, talented individuals to get into our business. And, I'm on the board and I'm doing the infomercial. The ICSC Foundation has multiple initiatives, to promote our business, our industry. the retailers, the developers, to demonstrate to a very broad and diversified a group of talented individuals how fun it is, how absolutely not boring it is to be part of our industry. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, Claude, I think that's a great way to end. However, because we're having such great conversation here, and the breakout rooms, we'll get a lot out of these discussions here. We're going to just extend this a little bit for a few more minutes and address some of the questions that we've seen on the chats here. And I think, in fairness to Wendy, who posted about community centers becoming local shopping centers being community centers, I think that's east to west across the country. We're seeing that, and I can give the example in secondary towns, especially where enclosed malls, those traditional enclosed malls, took a beating to suburban power center growth. And in Wetaskiwin, the Wetaskiwin Mall is repositioning themselves to become more of a medical professional center. And in these smaller towns, you're finding older demographics. And that's on the west side of the country. But here out in Nova Scotia, in parts of the Annapolis Valley, again, where there's an older demographic in play, and the mall has struggled with vacancy. It has still, to this point, never released the target space that was slated to open, but never ended up coming to fruition. The mall itself is looking at opportunities of how they can position themselves. And rather than new build in these communities, you have existing assets and high footfall coming from a need for wellness, medical centers, community centers, libraries, all of these things that Wendy alluded to there. So there are definitely opportunities. Avenue Living is the owner of the Wetaskiwin Mall, and they're actively working on that front. It's Choice REIT has stuff out here. So across the country, we can probably find many examples of how these centers are adapting and not being traditional retail. But in fact, what can happen is, because those community-led initiatives draw people more regularly, there are opportunities for other small retailers to benefit from that as a residual play. So David,
and the thing like that is, but don't everyone copy those models. I think that's what we always see in this industry, is something starts to work and then everyone floods. I think we need diversity right now. By the way, can I give a shout out to Wendy, who I know actually, and she's on the board of a thing Scott might be interested in. It's a collective of 152 artists and designers who've come together to co-sell and brand their various wares out of Granville Island, out here in Vancouver.
Oh, I'm familiar. I've been, actually.
There you go. And by the way, there's a lot of commentary in the questions right now about independent and both direct to consumer and retail. So I think that's obviously, we've struck a chord with people.
Yeah, I did really like that sentiment that you expressed before, David, which is, I do think the diversity of the offerings is important. I think local is something that's super difficult to scale, and to the degree that you can help facilitate that and sort of serve as a, I think for me, the idea of like anything as a platform is really interesting. And when you have the resources at your disposal and you can choose to sort of, who to support and lift up, I think that's quite interesting. There was an article I was reading in the New York Times that spoke about the retail situation in Soho, New York versus some of the smaller neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And the gist of what the reporter was getting at was that whereas Soho kind of lacked the neighborhood feel and the community to kind of align with the businesses that were there, the Brooklyn retail scene to a degree was thriving more because they were more integrated into the community. And I thought that was very interesting, just in terms of like, I've been reading a lot about people's willingness to support local, particularly now, perhaps more than ever. And so I think to the degree that you can support that and help to build community in physical environment, I think is really important.
We talked, David, sorry, I was going to say, we talked before in previous panels about anchors, and what we used to think of as anchors in the past may not be applicable today. And there's a question about to the panel of what we believe are the next generation anchors for retail places, and that could be, you know, whether malls or shopping centers, et cetera. And to my perspective there, this, like you were saying, we don't want cookie cutters. I think that each market and each area is unique for what works as an anchor. What works as one anchor in one place doesn't necessarily apply for anywhere else. And it's very unique. It could be a small business that has such an incredible draw that it actually works as a de facto anchor. Anchor doesn't necessarily have to mean it's size driven. It's what it presents to the community, respective of that community. But David, what do you think? Or Claude?
Well, can I just throw in on that, which is and Gary Newbury had a point underneath that in the chat where he's saying maybe that's an old paradigm. And just for argument's sake, maybe that notion that you need this big draw for the others to benefit from, maybe now if we're creating real synergy amongst equals within a space that are the right complements, then the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? Like maybe the center itself becomes a draw. And I think we can all probably come up with examples, US and Canada, where we've seen that work. It's just not commonly thought of.
I would absolutely totally agree. I think the definition of an anchor doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be retail. I think it has to complement retail. It has to bring some differentiation in the market, as well as elements that would help better serve the markets that the shopping center or the real estate is in. I think the whole notion of a traditional department store is being tested at the moment for all kinds of reasons. I think obviously, in the United States, it's a totally different environment. I think we've had our issues here in Canada in the last few years as it relates to department stores. But I think now going forward is the alternative use of those department stores will come from a better integration to the community, as you were pointing out.
Great. So I think we're also seeing, when I think the term anchor is, maybe it's an antiquated terminology as well. And we, as an industry, maybe there's some other way we can view that. Because I always think of an anchor as a big, heavy weight. And I think that really, as a metaphor, it's probably not the right metaphor that we can use as an industry. It's really what is the draw? What is what is that magnet more than anything else?
When I think shoppers view it, I also deal with groups that are big advocates for independent, and they kind of. I also don't want to glorify every single small business. Like a lot of small business is bad. Let's put it on the table. It's everything, right? There's excellent, bad, everything in between. But for the shopper to have a district they want to go to, even though they say they want to buy local, they do, but they also want to get things that are tried and true. They need that mix. So having really solid chains in amongst complementary independent is kind of, I think, the holy grail of this exercise, not one or the other. So that's one comment. And then I just noticed Chris in the chat had mentioned they're looking at an incubator in their town center and for talent as well as innovation. I love that. One thing we haven't talked about here is there's so much government support. Like somehow I said we have to support failure, right? Like for this to work, the way and Scott would know more than anyone on this panel, for innovation to work, you have to embrace the idea you're going to try something, it's not going to work, but you're going to learn from it. And I think in the retail environment, it's a very harsh environment for that. Whereas if you have friends who are in technology companies, they're doing it all the time. And man, can they ever tap a lot of money for harebrained ideas? I got to tell you right now, like just if they could put something together as a pitch deck and kind of get into an incubator for tech, because there's always this notion, hey, if one thing scales globally, then we all win, we make a lot of money. But what about a lot more doing pretty good for everybody, right? And I don't mean that in a socialist way. I just mean from an investment point of view. I think the government and policymakers need to start shifting back and saying maybe we need to incubate homegrown brands and new retail concepts. And there's got to be some fun. There is just really no funding for that I can see.
One thing this leads to another discussion, and we've always got these things in our back pocket, and this topic can go on we could talk about this obviously in many hours, but the idea of warehousing, industrial types of uses, where does that now play and evolve in the retail world? And we're seeing that blurring even more than the past, and I think that might be an interesting conversation. This was raised to us in a webinar we gave in Northern Alberta a month ago, and someone was asking, well, what about industrial? Is that an appropriate question for retail? And I think it is. So open it up, Claude.
No, I mean briefly. My 2 cents on this is I think we have to make a distinction between hardcore logistics and micro fulfillment. Okay, hardcore logistics, i.e., having a big space dedicated to the fulfillment of online transactions, purely at the end of a mall with 53-footers, back and forth, a residential area or whatever. I'm not so sure that there is added value at the end of the day for the creation of value for the rest of the mall. First and foremost, also you have to deal with the city and having the entitlements to do so. But what relates to micro fulfillment, I think all the retailers have been revisiting how they fulfill their online transactions, and we're going to see more and more of this into their design of their physical space, having a dedicated space for the fulfillment of online transactions and to be more efficient. As retail developers, we have to find ways to adapt the environment for all the new traffic that's being generated with this. But that's why I make a distinction between the two.
One of our longtime clients was Lee Valley Tools, and I don't know how many of you know them, but in so many ways you could say, hey, they have to play catch up on what their stores look like and their website and things like that. But their model of pick and pack from store and start a order online and pick up in store, they've been doing that for years. They do it like they breathe. So it's just sort of funny what we think is kind of archaic again suddenly leapfrogs into the future, but then there's other needs they have that aren't being addressed.
I'm thinking about launching a new concept called consumers distributing.
there, right? And Scott, I don't know if you know them, but it was a catalog jeweler, basically, kind of more value price. But you'd go in, you'd fill out a paper form from a display case and put your order in. They pick and pack from the back.
Amazing. I was just reminded recently of a store called Service Merchandise, which was in the U.S., which was very similar, where it was, basically one item out on the sales floor of everything they sold, and then you would pick up everything at the end ultimately from filling things out. So was not successful back then. Who knows if it will make a resurgence at this point.
Well,
can I add one more thing in here that we haven't touched on, just for quick commentary? Like we've just named it, but this notion of pop-up, I've seen there's a Canadian brand called Latest Scoop that was doing it with fax machines, basically in the late 90s, one of the first. I don't think it's anywhere reached what its potential could be. And maybe we use it as a term pop-up, but just the idea of alternative retail space, something that when we talk about independence, coming and going, well, maybe we designed to let come and go happen. And that reminds me of pop-up. And maybe that's a little corner of a shopping center, but I'm sure there's a lot of street front or districts that could really benefit from that kind of thinking. And Rick Bahanas on our team's been looking at that for about the last 4 years, and store-in-store, innovative store-in-store.
Decathlon is the European largest sporting goods company in the world, and they in preparation for their opening at the shopping center in Dartmouth had opened a pop-up store and operated that, and it was right at the peak of the pandemic that they opened their pop-up store, but they had additional social media reach and communications. And what was really unique about that is that every time someone was hired within the company, they profiled that employee. They profiled the people, and that speaks to Claude's talent. But not only did they have a pop-up shop that had, key items that people might want. It certainly couldn't be everything that's replicated in the 35,000 square feet of space. But the fact that they started to promote the activities of the employees and bringing people in, I thought was very compelling, and it created an attachment to the brand, even though it is already one of your larger retailers in the world. But setting up shop, and it has, led to their so far so good success in Dartmouth, and I know they're expanding across Canada as well as a chain.